40 minutes into Breaking Bad, Walter White is standing in the middle of a desert road in his underwear with a pistol pressed under his chin. He's already recorded the goodbye video. He's made his peace with it. And the only reason we got another 4.5 seasons of television is that he couldn't work out where the safety catch was. That's what tonight is about. Every moment where the universe quietly decided that Walter White wasn't finished yet. Not the clever bits, not the chemistry, not the famous speeches, the coin flips, the phone that buzzed at the right second, the guard who didn't check the boot of the car, the brother-in-law who simply couldn't picture it. We'll go in order, pilot to finale, and nothing here builds towards anything. There's no big reveal at the end. If you drift off somewhere around season 2, you haven't missed a payoff. Because there isn't one. That's rather the point. If you fancy more of this sort of thing, subscribing helps. That's the last I'll mention it. Let's get into it. Here's the thing I keep circling back to whenever I rewatch this show, and it took me an embarrassing number of rewatches to properly notice. Walt is competent. That part is real. The chemistry is real. The improvisation is real. And when he's cornered, his brain genuinely does move faster than everyone else's in the room. Nobody's arguing otherwise. But underneath almost every single famous Heisenberg moment, if you actually pull the scene apart, there's one variable sitting right in the middle of it that Walt had absolutely no control over. Not one he managed, not one he anticipated, one that simply went his way. And the show is quite sly about how it hides this, because it hides it inside Walt's confidence. He walks out of a room alive, and he assumes he walked out because he's clever. We assume it too, because we're watching him from behind his own eyes most of the time. It's only when you slow down and look at the mechanics that you notice how often the thing that saved him was a stranger's mood, a bit of timing, or a piece of hardware behaving unexpectedly. The other thing worth putting down now, because it comes up constantly and I don't want to keep explaining it, is Hank. Hank Schrader is the single largest asset Walter White has for most of this show, and Walt didn't earn it. Hank cannot imagine Walt as a criminal. Not won't, can't. His mental model of his brother-in-law is a mild, slightly sad, bald chemistry teacher who once corrected his grammar at a barbecue, and every piece of evidence that lands in Hank's hands gets filtered through that model before it reaches his conscience. The evidence loses every time for years. That blind spot is doing more work for Walt than Saul Goodman, Gus Fring, and the entire Super Lab combined. So that's the lens for tonight, competence versus chance, and a man who never quite knew which one was carrying him. If you made me put a number on it, I'd say 60-40 in favor of luck. I'll tell you at the end whether I still think that. The RV is parked in the middle of nowhere. Jesse's brought his distributors along to look at the product, and within about 90 seconds, the whole thing has gone sideways in a way nobody in that vehicle planned for. Emilio Koyama takes one look at Walt and knows him. Not by name, by face. He'd been picked up in a DEA raid not long before, and Walt had been standing there in the background, riding along with Hank, playing tourist. Emilio remembers. And the conclusion he draws is entirely reasonable given the information he has, which is that this middle-aged bloke in a green shirt is an informant, and that Jesse has walked them straight into a trap. So the gun comes out, and I want to be honest about where Walt is at this exact moment in the story, because it's easy to forget once you've got the pork pie hat in your head. He's a high school teacher. He has no street instincts, no read on these men, no leverage, no plan, and no idea what he's doing. He hasn't killed anyone. He hasn't threatened anyone. He's had the second life for roughly 3 weeks. If Emilio pulls that trigger, the show ends, and it ends because of something Walt did before the story even started. What saves him is that Crazy 8 gets curious. That's it. That's the whole thing. Crazy 8 looks at the crystal, works out that the quality is genuinely extraordinary, and decides that a dead chemist is worth less than a living one who will teach him the process. Business instinct beats paranoia by a hair. He tells Walt to come out and show him how it's done, which is, if you think about it, the last mistake he ever makes. because that decision hands Walt a chemistry set and about 4 minutes of privacy. And those are the only two things Walt actually needs. He mixes red phosphorus and water, generates phosphine gas, and slams the door on both of them. Emilio dies almost immediately. Crazy 8 doesn't, which becomes its own problem, but we'll get to that. What I find genuinely fascinating here is that Walt's chemistry knowledge saves him twice inside the same scene, in 2 completely different ways. First, as a bargaining chip, the reason he's kept alive is that his brain is valuable. Then, as a weapon, the exact same asset deployed defensively and then offensively within the span of a few minutes, and neither use was planned. But the pivot point, the actual hinge, isn't anything Walt did. It's a drug dealer being marginally more interested in profit than in self-preservation. If Crazy 8 had been the sort of man who shoots first and works out the details afterwards, and plenty of men in that line of work are exactly that, the entirety of Breaking Bad would be a cold open. A teacher, an RV, 2 dealers, and nothing after it. The whole series rests on a bloke being a slightly better businessman than he was a killer. I don't know what to do with that, really. The sirens are what get him. He's already had the worst morning of his life. There's a body in the RV, another man unconscious, a brush fire he started spreading behind him, and he's crashed the vehicle into a ditch trying to escape his own gas. He's in his pants and a shirt, in the desert, with a wallet full of nothing, and a life he can no longer explain to anybody. Then he hears the sirens, and he does the maths. Double homicide, meth lab on wheels, cancer diagnosis, wife, son, unborn daughter. He records a goodbye on the camcorder, that stiff, awkward little speech that he clearly hasn't rehearsed and can't get right, and then he walks into the middle of the road, points a stolen pistol at his own chin, and pulls the trigger. Nothing happens. He tries again. Nothing. So he stands there in the road, in his underwear, fiddling with an unfamiliar handgun. And while he's turning it over in his hands, it goes off and puts a round straight into the dirt. The weapon works. It worked the whole time. He simply didn't know how it operated, because why would he? He'd taken it off a dead man about 20 minutes earlier, and then the vehicles come around the bend and they're fire trucks. They're not police at all. They're on their way to deal with the brush fire that he started. So there are 2 separate strokes of luck stacked on top of each other in the space of about a minute, and they're pulling in completely opposite directions. The first is a piece of hardware refusing to do what he asked it to do. The second is that he was wrong about what was coming. This is the one I'd point to if somebody asked me for a single example of what tonight is actually about. Everything else Walt ever does, the manipulation, the chemistry, the lying, you can at least argue his skill was involved. Not here. Here he tried to remove himself from his own story and was prevented by his own ignorance of a mechanical safety catch. And the counterfactual is genuinely bleak when you sit with it. If he'd known how a gun worked, Walter White dies in episode 1 as a man who murdered 2 drug dealers and then panicked. No Heisenberg. No empire. Skyler finds out from a police officer at the door. Walt Jr. grows up knowing his father as a small, sad news story. There's no legacy, no money, no blue meth, nothing. The show he'd have been the protagonist of would be about 45 minutes long. Instead, he stands there watching fire engines go past, breathing hard, alive, and something in his face changes. He puts the gun down. He goes home. He gets in the shower, and the next morning he's a different man, which is exactly the sort of thing that happens to people who've been handed an unearned second chance and decided it means something. There's a scene where Walt sits at Jesse's kitchen counter with a torn out sheet of paper and writes a list. Reasons to kill Crazy 8 on one side, reasons to let him live on the other. The "let him live" column fills up quickly. It's judgmental. It's Christian. Murder is wrong. He won't be able to live with himself. He'd be sacrificing his own moral standing. He writes about 6 or 7 items, and they're all variations on the same instinct. which is that he doesn't want to be a person who does this. The other column has one line on it. If Crazy 8 goes free, he'll come back and kill Walt's entire family. That's the calculation. 6 good reasons against one terrible one, and the terrible one is winning on weight alone. So Walt does what people do when they can't make a decision. He goes looking for permission. He brings the man in the basement a sandwich, he brings him a beer. They talk about their fathers, about the family business, about a shop called Tampico Furniture where Crazy 8's dad sold sofas. And the conversation is warm in a way that neither of them expected. Walt is very obviously building himself a case for mercy. He wants to be talked into it. And then, while he's making a second sandwich, his lungs give out, and he goes down hard on the concrete floor, out cold. The yellow ceramic plate goes with him and shatters. He wakes up alone, sweeps the pieces into the bin, makes a new plate of food, and genuinely intends to go downstairs and unlock the bike lock. That's the plan. He's decided. Then something nags at him. He can't articulate it, and neither can we, watching. He goes back to the bin, pulls the shards out, and starts fitting them together on the counter like a jigsaw. And there's a gap. One long, sharp piece is missing. Crazy 8, while Walt was unconscious a few feet away, reached out and took a weapon. What gets me about this one is that the luck runs in both directions, and neither direction is comfortable. Walt is lucky he noticed a slightly less obsessive man throws that bin bag out without a second thought and dies in a basement in his first fortnight as a criminal. But he's also, in a horrible way, lucky that he collapsed at all. If his body hadn't failed him at that precise moment, the plate never breaks, Crazy 8 never gets the shard, and Walt walks down those stairs and unlocks a man he has no way of knowing intends to kill him. The illness that's supposedly killing him saved his life. That's the kind of thing the show does when it's in a good mood. He goes back down. He asks the question, the moment I do this, are you going to stick me with that piece of plate? And Crazy 8's face does the rest of the work. Then the bike lock, and the worst 30 seconds of Walter White's life to that point, and the apology he keeps repeating afterwards to nobody. I'll be honest, this is the one entry tonight where the word lucky sits badly in my mouth. Surviving is lucky. What survival cost him here isn't. And the show knows that, which is why it never lets him be relieved about it. Right? Something lighter. Walt is sitting outside a credit union waiting for a parking space. Indicator on, doing everything correctly, when a silver BMW swings around him and takes it. The driver is a stockbroker named Ken Wins, and he is, without exaggeration, one of the most perfectly irritating people ever put on television. Bluetooth headset, personalized plate reading Ken Wins, shouting about portfolios at a volume calibrated to make sure the entire car park knows he's important. Walt says nothing. He drives off. He goes about his day. And then later, the universe does him a small favor and parks that same BMW at a petrol station forecourt while Walt happens to be there. Ken is inside, still shouting into the headset, still oblivious. Most people at this point feel a brief flash of something and then go home. Walt pops the bonnet, drops a wet squeegee across the battery terminals to short the thing out, and walks away while it turns into a fireball behind him. Now, I love this scene. It's funny, it's satisfying, and Bryan Cranston plays the walk away from the explosion with this small private smile that tells you everything about where the character is heading. But strip the entertainment out of it and look at what actually happened. He committed arson in daylight on a petrol station forecourt, surrounded by CCTV, pumps, staff, and customers. No mask, no gloves, no plan for what happens if somebody looks up. He didn't check the cameras, he didn't wait for cover, he didn't consider for 1 second that petrol stations are, of all the places on Earth, probably the most comprehensively filmed. He simply bet his entire future on nobody happening to glance in his direction. And here's the detail I find genuinely mad about it. This isn't even a crime he needed to commit. Everything else he does, you can trace back to some pressure he's under. Cancer, money, threats, Jesse. This one is pure irritation. This is a man with terminal lung cancer and a secret meth operation risking an arson charge because somebody was rude about a parking space. A single member of staff looking out of the window, and Walt's story ends as a slightly baffling local news item. Chemistry teacher charged after car fire. The police would have pulled the footage, run the plate, knocked on his door, and the whole thing unravels before he's cooked a second batch. Because once anyone starts pulling on the thread of Walter White's recent behavior, there's rather a lot of thread there. Nobody looks. Nobody calls. Ken wins, loses a car, and the show carries on. It's the pettiest close call in the entire series, and I think about it more than I think about most of the big ones. The gas mask is the loose thread, and it's a stupid one to leave. After the disaster with the RV, Walt and Jesse chuck their masks into the desert on the way out. Fine in the moment, panicked people do panicked things. Except the DEA finds one and the lab traces it back through the serial number to J.P. Wynne High School, which is, of course, the school where Walter White teaches chemistry. So Hank turns up at Walt's workplace holding the physical evidence of Walt's first double homicide and asks him to go through the inventory logs. The scene is a small masterpiece of discomfort. Walt is sweating. He's flicking through the equipment records with Hank standing over his shoulder, knowing full well that the Erlenmeyer flasks and the round bottom flask and the 200 milliliter beakers are all missing because he personally walked out of the building with them. He can barely hold a sentence together. And Hank looks at him and says, deadpan, that they don't want people to start wondering about him. There's a pause, a genuine pause, where the room goes quiet and Walt's entire life is balanced on whether his brother-in-law is joking. Then Hank laughs, because of course he's joking. The idea is absurd to him. It's so absurd it's funny, and he says it out loud precisely because it's funny. But the DEA still has an open case and a school full of suspects, and that case needed to land somewhere. It lands on Hugo Archuleta. Hugo is the janitor. Hugo has a possession charge in his past and a joint in his car on the day they search it. And that is the entirety of the evidence against him. He's arrested at the school in front of everyone, hands behind his back, walked out past the students. And Hugo, it's worth saying, is a genuinely kind man. When Walt was throwing up in the staff toilets from the chemo, Hugo was the one who helped him, brought him a mop, didn't make a thing of it, didn't tell anyone. He's about the only person in that building who treated Walt decently without wanting anything for it. Walt Jr. asks about it later while the family is playing poker in the living room. Why were they arresting Mr. Archuleta? He's a pretty cool guy. And Walt gives some non-answer about how you never really know people and eats his food. This is the first time in the show that Walt's luck has a price tag attached to it, and somebody else pays it. Not a drug dealer, not a criminal, not someone who took a risk and lost. A cleaner with a joint in his glove box loses his job and his liberty so that a chemistry teacher can keep cooking. I don't think the show is subtle about this, and I don't think it's trying to be. It's establishing the pattern early, so that when it happens again, and it happens a lot, you already know the shape of it. The investigation had to stop somewhere. Walt is simply lucky it stopped at the man mopping the corridors rather than the man who ordered the glassware. The hat is the tell. Walt shaves his head, buys a pork pie hat off a rack, and drives to Tuco Salamanca's headquarters to get money that a violent cartel distributor has already decided he isn't paying. Jesse is in hospital with his face rearranged. The polite approach has visibly failed. So Walt walks in as somebody else entirely, gives a false name, and asks for $50,000. Tuco laughs at him. Naturally, he does. A middle-aged, bald man in a hat has just walked into a room full of armed men and asked for money he is owed, and brought what appears to be a bag of product with him. which from Tuco's point of view means he's brought more merchandise to be robbed of. Walt takes a crystal out of the bag and throws it at the floor. The windows go out. The whole floor of the building shakes. There's plaster in the air and men on the ground, and Tuco is sitting there stunned with his ears ringing, and Walt tells him it isn't meth, it's fulminated mercury, and there's about a pound of it in the bag. Two separate things go right for him here, and neither one was guaranteed. The first is the physics. Fulminated mercury is a primary explosive, and a pound of it is not a threat, it's a demolition job. Walt is standing across a room from a quantity of material that, if the bag had gone up rather than the single crystal, would have taken up that floor and everyone standing on it, himself very much included. He's carried it up several flights of stairs in a holdall. He's been jostled. He's set it down on a table. The margin between a controlled demonstration and killing himself along with everyone in the building is genuinely thin, and he had no way to calibrate it precisely. The second thing, and this is the bigger one, is that Tuco's men let him leave. Think about who's in that room. These are impulsive, violent men whose default response to disrespect is immediate and permanent. A stranger has just blown out the windows of their office and humiliated their boss in front of them. The instinctive reaction, the one you'd bet on 9 times out of 10, is to fill him with holes the moment the dust settles and work out who he was afterwards. Instead, they're too shocked to move, and Tuco, who is many things but is at least consistent, decides he respects it. He says Walt's got balls, he pays, he even seems delighted about it. He walked in there gambling that a room full of armed men would be more impressed by the chemistry than offended by the nerve of it. That's not a plan. That's a guess about human behavior made by somebody who had never so much as spoken to a criminal before that month. And it worked, which is the problem, because this is the moment Walt learns the wrong lesson permanently. He walks out of that building with a bag of cash, believing that audacity is a strategy, that if you're bold enough and clever enough, the room bends around you. He's going to spend the next 4 seasons applying that lesson in situations where it very nearly kills him. It's the luckiest wrong lesson in television, I reckon. And nobody's ever going to correct it for him, because the one time it mattered, it happened to be true. Now, before we get into season 2, I want to talk a bit about why any of this is in the show in the first place. Because there's an obvious objection to a video like this, which is that all fiction is a series of authorial decisions, so calling any of it luck is a bit of a category error. Nothing happens by chance in a television program. Somebody sat in a room in Burbank and decided the fire engines would come around the corner, and that's true. But it's also the interesting part rather than a reason to stop looking. From what I remember of the interviews around the show, Vince Gilligan was quite open about being drawn to chance and consequence as subject matter. The idea that a single, unremarkable decision can cascade into something enormous, and that people almost never get to see the cascade from the outside. The writer's room worked to a principle that Walt should always be able to almost get away with it. Not comfortably, not cleanly, almost. That's a very deliberate design, and it produces a specific effect on the audience that I think is underrated. You end up complicit. You're sitting there hoping the coin lands the right way up for a man you've watched murder people, and you don't entirely notice you're doing it, because the show has made the near miss the basic unit of its storytelling. The other thing worth flagging is that the kind of luck changes as the seasons go on, and it changes fairly precisely. Season 1 is about survival. Guns, gas, explosives, physical danger, things that could kill him in the next 4 minutes. From season 2 onwards, it stops being about staying alive and starts being about not getting caught, which is a completely different game with different rules and much slower fuses. So that's where we're going next. Nothing dramatic happens in this one, and I've always liked it for that. Walt wants better product, which means moving off pseudoephedrine and onto methylamine, which means acquiring a barrel of an extremely controlled industrial chemical. There's no legitimate route, so he and Jesse break into a chemical warehouse with a bit of thermite scraped out of an Etch-A sketch, burn through a padlock, and wheel a barrel out on a hand truck in the middle of the night. It works beautifully. It's one of the few operations in the whole series that goes exactly to plan. but there's CCTV and the footage lands on Hank's desk. So there's a scene where Hank sits in a dark room, scrubbing back and forth through grainy security video of two men stealing a barrel of methylamine, and one of those men is his brother-in-law, and he is looking directly at him. And he gets nothing. Not because he isn't paying attention, he watches it repeatedly, he clocks the professionalism of the thermite, he takes it seriously as a lead. But the masks are on, the lighting is poor, the angles are bad, and there is simply nothing on that tape that distinguishes Walt from any other man of roughly that height. No face, no gait he'd recognize, no vehicle plate, no voice. What I find interesting about this entry is that the luck is an absence. There's no dramatic moment, no last-second save, nothing to point at. The thing that protects Walt is that a camera fitted in about 1998 pointed at a loading bay didn't happen to capture anything useful. That's it. That's the whole entry, and I'm not going to inflate it, because half of what keeps Walt free isn't a rescue, it's a gap in somebody's data. Let's talk about the bell. Tuco has gone properly paranoid by this point. The DEA has hit his crew, his cousins are in the wind, and the cartel has decided the only sensible plan is to take his cook and his cook's partner across the border to work for them indefinitely. So he kidnaps Walt and Jesse and drives them out to a shack in the desert where his Uncle Hector sits in a wheelchair, unable to speak, communicating exclusively through a small brass bell. Walt has ricin, he's ground it into a powder, and he's got a plan to get it into Tuco's food. And the plan is decent. Hector destroys it by ringing the bell. He can't talk, he can't write, he can barely move. But he watches Walt sprinkle something into the burrito and he starts hammering that bell with everything he's got, over and over, until Tuco works out what it means. The entire operation collapses because a man with no functioning body still had a functioning brain and one small piece of brass. What follows is chaos. A fight, a struggle over a gun, Jesse getting a shot into Tuco, both of them scrambling out towards the car. And then a vehicle appears in the distance on the desert track and they hide, because they assume it's more Salamancas coming to finish the job. It's Hank. Hank has been looking for Walt for 2 days. He's been chasing Jesse's car through a LoJack signal on the theory that Jesse might lead him to his missing brother-in-law. And instead, he's driven straight into a shootout with a wounded, enraged cartel distributor. He wins it. He kills Tuco in the dirt with his Glock 22 service pistol and a lot of adrenaline, and he ends up with a promotion and a dental grill in a lucite cube on his desk. And Walt and Jesse are lying about 20 yards away in the scrub the entire time. The timing window here is genuinely absurd when you lay it out. If Hank arrives 10 minutes earlier, he drives up on Walt and Jesse mid-struggle with a cartel figure in a location with no innocent explanation whatsoever, and the show is over that afternoon. If he arrives 10 minutes later, Tuco has almost certainly finished what he started. He arrives in the only window where his presence saves them rather than destroys them, and then, having killed the single biggest threat to Walt's life, he gets back in his car without ever looking at the scrub 20 yards to his left. I don't think Walt ever fully appreciated that one. He was rather busy. After the desert, Walt has a problem that isn't about danger at all. It's about narrative. He's been missing for days, and he needs a story that explains it. And the story has to hold up against a wife who's already suspicious, a DEA agent, and a hospital full of people whose job is asking questions. So he walks into a supermarket, takes his clothes off, and wanders through the aisles under the strip lighting until somebody calls an ambulance. Then he tells them he has no memory of any of it. The cover story is a dissociative fugue state, which he blames on the medication and the stress of the diagnosis. And I want to be clear that the plan here is good. It's one of the cleverest things Walt ever does, precisely because it doesn't require anyone to believe anything specific. It requires them to be unable to disprove something vague. But the luck sits underneath the cleverness, and there are two pieces of it. The first is medical. A fugue state isn't something you can test for. There's no scan, no blood marker, no objective finding that says, yes, this happened, or no, it didn't. The neurologist can only observe that Walt presents plausibly and that the presentation is consistent with an enormous amount of psychological stress, which, given the man has terminal cancer, it obviously is. If Walt had picked almost any other condition, a doctor would have caught him inside an hour. The second, and I think this is the bigger one, is that everyone in that room wants it to be true. Skylar wants it to be true because the alternative is that her husband is lying to her about something significant. Hank wants it to be true because he likes Walt, and the alternative is uncomfortable. Walt Jr. wants it to be true because his dad is ill. And this is a thing illness does. The story isn't landing on neutral ground. It's landing on a family who are all quietly relieved to have an explanation. There's a lovely, uncomfortable moment where Skylar visibly doesn't buy it and says nothing. And you can see the marriage take a small, permanent injury. But she says nothing. A fake symptom that nobody can test for, delivered to an audience that's already hoping it's real. That's about as efficient an escape as this show ever gives him. Now, this one's daft, and I mean that affectionately. Badger gets arrested selling on a street corner to an undercover officer, which is exactly the sort of thing that happens when your distribution network is composed of people whose main qualification is that they were available. And Badger, being Badger, is one sympathetic conversation away from telling the police absolutely everything he knows, which includes the existence of a man called Heisenberg. So Walt and Jesse hire a lawyer off a bus bench, which is how Saul Goodman enters the story. Saul's solution is not legal. Saul's solution is theater. He finds a man named Jimmy Kilkelly, known professionally as Jimmy In and Out, on account of how frequently he goes in and comes out, and pays him to sit in a bar, wear a hat, and confess to being Heisenberg to the same undercover officer. And it works. The DEA gets a Heisenberg. They put him in a cell and they close a line of inquiry, and the actual Heisenberg goes home and has his tea. I love this because it's the first time in the series that Walt's problem is solved entirely by somebody else, using a method he would never have thought of, and he barely registers it. He's cross about the fee. That's his main takeaway. But look at what's actually protecting him at that moment. Not chemistry, not nerve, not intelligence. The existence of a professional criminal willing to rent out his identity for cash, and a lawyer who happened to know his phone number. If Saul's Rolodex hadn't contained a man like that, or if Jimmy had been in prison that week, Badger talks, and the name Heisenberg goes into a DEA file attached to a description of a bald man in a hat, 2 full seasons before Hank is ready to hear it. Walt's entire secret identity survived because a stranger fancied a payday. I want to slow right down for this one because it's the only entry tonight that's good news. Walt goes in for a scan. He's been through the chemo, he's been through the desert, he's been through 4 days stranded in an RV with a dead battery, convinced he was going to die of dehydration before the cancer got the chance. He's exhausted. He goes into the consulting room expecting the worst, because the worst is what he's been organizing his entire life around for the better part of a year. And the doctor tells him the tumor has shrunk by around 80%. The family is delighted. There's a party. Everyone's crying in the good way. And Walt goes into the toilets alone and beats a paper towel dispenser off the wall. Now, I've heard people argue about that scene for years, and I don't think it's actually complicated. He isn't angry that he's living. He's angry because the diagnosis was his permission slip. Everything he'd done, the cooking, the money, the 2 men in the RV, the man in the basement, was justified by an ending that was coming regardless. Take the ending away and the justification goes with it, and what's left is a man who did all that because he wanted to. The luck here is entirely real and entirely medical. He responded to treatment. Some people do, some people don't. And there is no version of that outcome where Walt's cleverness contributed anything at all. He got months he had no right to expect, And every single thing that happens in the rest of this show happens inside that borrowed time. And what he does with it is keep cooking. I've always thought that's the most damning thing in the series, and it's delivered without a single line of dialogue calling attention to it. He gets given his life back, and he spends it on the meth. Two men are sitting at a bar, a few stools apart, and neither of them knows they're connected by a catastrophe that hasn't finished happening yet. Jane Margolis has become, from Walt's perspective, an unsolvable problem. She's clean-eyed, she's sharp, she's worked out exactly who he is, and she's told him plainly that a high school teacher turned drug dealer with a DEA agent in the family would make an extraordinary story. She wants Jesse's half of the money. If she doesn't get it, she picks up the phone. Walt hands over the cash. He has no choice, and he knows it, and he drives away from that house genuinely beaten. Then he goes to a bar, and he sits next to a man who wants to talk about his daughter. Donald Margolis doesn't say her name. He talks in general terms about a grown child who's a nightmare, who's broken his heart repeatedly, who he cannot give up on. And Walt asks him why he doesn't, and Donald says the obvious thing, because she's family and you don't get to stop. Walt sits with that. And then he drives to Jesse's house in the middle of the night because he's decided he isn't going to give up on him either. What happens next takes about 90 seconds, and it's the hinge. The entire back half of this show swings on. They're both unconscious. Jesse's on his back on the bed, and Jane's beside him on her side. And Walt is shaking Jesse by the shoulder, trying to wake him. And in doing so, he knocks into Jane, and she rolls over. Onto her back. That's all. A man reaching across a bed catches somebody with his arm, and she starts to choke. His first movement is towards her. You can see it. He starts to reach. The instinct is right there. And then he stops, and he stands, and he watches. I'm not going to dress this up. This is the moment the character stops being someone you can argue for, and the show films it very plainly in one room with almost no music because it doesn't need any help. But the luck is real, and it's worth being precise about what it consisted of. Walt didn't plan a single element of this. He didn't know Donald was Jane's father. He didn't know the pair of them were unconscious. He didn't lay a hand on her deliberately. Every step that put him in that bedroom at that minute was somebody else's doing, and the physical contact was an accident. The threat to his freedom removed itself while he stood in the room, and all he had to do was nothing. If he'd gone to a different bar, if Donald had worked a different shift, if his elbow had come down 2 inches to the left. Jane stays on her side, wakes up in the morning, and she and Jesse take the money and vanish. And Walt spends the rest of his life waiting for a phone call that could come any day. I don't enjoy this one. I've never enjoyed this one. But it's the single largest piece of luck in the first half of the series, and leaving it out would be dishonest. The teddy bear turns up in the pool first if you're watching in order. Charred, pink, one eye missing, floating face down. And the show refuses to tell you what it means for most of a season. What it means is that 2 aircraft collided directly over Walt's house. The chain runs like this. Donald Margolis is an air traffic controller. His daughter dies. He goes back to work far too soon because grief does that to people who need something to hold on to, and he makes a mistake at his station that puts a Wayfarer flight and a private aircraft into the same piece of sky. 167 people die, and the debris comes down across Albuquerque, including on the White family's road. And the line from that back to Walt is completely traceable. He let Jane die. Jane's death broke her father. Her father was directing aeroplanes. But nobody in that world ever draws it, because nobody in that world has the information. There's no investigation that reaches him. There's no line of inquiry, no interview, no name in a file. The disaster that he is causally connected to is officially the fault of a bereaved man's error. Full stop. And that's not even wrong. It's just not complete. The show puts it in front of him repeatedly, mind you. He has to stand in a school assembly and give a hopeless improvised speech about perspective. He has to fish debris out of his own swimming pool. There's a stretch there where he's scooping wreckage out of the water in his garden with a net. And one of the things he pulls out is a small plastic eye from a burnt teddy bear, and he keeps it, which is a strange thing to do, and the show never explains why. So put it somewhere in the back of your mind, because that eye is going to turn up twice more before we're finished, and both times it's going to be sitting quietly in a scene where something much worse is about to happen. Since we're on the subject of that teddy bear, let's talk for a minute about the way this show handles the idea of a debt. Because there's a visual habit that runs through Breaking Bad, and once you notice it, you can't stop. Things fall out of the sky. Debris comes down on the house. A cold open shows you an object, a plastic eye, a pink bear, a burnt pair of glasses, a barrel in a desert, before the story has given you any way to understand it, and then the story catches up to it weeks or months later. It's a very particular trick, and I think it's doing something more than suspense. It's building an atmosphere in which consequences already exist. They're simply out of order. The bill has been generated, you just haven't been shown the total yet. And that atmosphere is what makes Walt's luck feel different to plot convenience. When something goes his way in this show, it doesn't feel like the writer's letting him off. It feels like an installment being deferred. He's not escaping, he's borrowing. The other thing I'd flag, looking back at where we've got to, the physics has mostly finished. Guns not firing, explosives behaving, plates breaking at useful moments. From here on, almost everything that saves Walter White is a decision made by another human being who could easily have decided otherwise, which is a much less comfortable kind of luck, because it means the people around him were always the walls of the box. Walt is standing at the edge of his own swimming pool with a net on a pole, fishing money out of the water. That's the image this one starts on. The house is half packed, Skylar has asked him to leave. The pool still has bits of aircraft in it, and Walt is skimming banknotes off the surface because a bag of cash went into the water during the crash cleanup, and he can hardly ask the pool company to sort it out. He gets the notes, he also gets the little plastic eye, which he pockets again, because apparently that's just a thing he does now. Then Hank pulls up to help him move house, and Walt has a duffel bag by the door with roughly $500,000 in it. Not hidden, not disguised, sitting on the floor by the front door in a house that a DEA agent has just walked into. Hank grabs it because Hank is the sort of man who takes the heavy bag off the ill bloke without being asked, and he immediately clocks the weight. He says something like, "Jesus, what have you got in there, cinder blocks?" And Walt, after the smallest pause you've ever seen, says, $500,000 in cash. Hank laughs. He says that's the spirit, and he carries it out to the car for him. The pause is the whole scene, by the way. Watch it again, and watch what Cranston does with about 1.5 seconds of screen time. He considers a lie, he rejects the lie, and then he tells the truth specifically because he's worked out in that 1.5 seconds that the truth is the safest thing he can possibly say, which is horrible and brilliant in equal measure, and it tells you exactly how confident Walt has become in that blind spot we talked about earlier. He's not surviving the moment, he's playing with it. There's a small glint in his face when Hank reaches for the bag, and it isn't fear. But the confidence is still a bet. Hank is a federal agent with functioning hands who has just registered that a bag is unusually heavy. The zip is right there. All it takes is one moment of Hank thinking, "Hang on, that's a funny joke. Let's see what the punchline is." And there is no version of Walter White's life that survives a DEA agent opening that bag on the driveway. He doesn't open it. He laughs, he lifts it, and he puts $500,000 of drug money in the boot of his brother-in-law's car with a smile on his face. That's the first time Walt genuinely enjoys the danger, I think. It's not the last. Right, this is the one nobody counts, and I think it's the biggest of the lot. Skylar knows, not suspects knows. She's worked it out from the inside, the way a spouse does by assembling a year of small wrongnesses into one enormous obvious thing. The second phone, the missing hours, the fugue state she never believed for a second, the gambling story that doesn't survive contact with basic arithmetic. She sits him down and she gets the confession out of him, and then she has to decide what to do with it. And what she has available to her is genuinely comprehensive. She has motive to act, she has moral clarity, and crucially, she has Hank. Her sister is married to the DEA agent running the Heisenberg investigation. She does not need evidence. She does not need to build a case. She needs one phone call and about 4 sentences, and Walter White's life ends that afternoon. She doesn't make the call. What she asks for instead is a divorce, and for him to stay away from the children, and her stated reasoning is entirely about protection. Walt Jr. finding out what his father is, the family being dragged through it, Hank's career, Marie, all of it. She's not covering for Walt. She's covering for everyone standing behind Walt. But the effect is identical either way. The single most complete threat to Walt's freedom in the entire series decides, for reasons that have nothing to do with him, not to pull the trigger. And here's why I'd rank this above almost everything else we've covered. Every other close call is an event. Something happens, it goes his way, it's over. This one is a standing decision that has to be renewed every single day for the rest of the show. Every morning Skylar wakes up and doesn't ring. The police is another day Walt gets. She could change her mind at any point. She nearly does more than once. There's a whole sequence later where she's sitting in a police station having genuinely decided to do it and gets talked out of it by circumstance. Walt does very little to earn this and quite a lot to jeopardize it. He argues with her. He moves back into the house against her wishes. He buys cars he can explain and generally behaves as though her silence is a fixed feature of the landscape rather than a choice a person is making. It looks like a marriage collapsing, which is why nobody files it under luck. But structurally, it's the largest single thing keeping him out of prison from season 3 onwards. And it's entirely in someone else's hands. If you asked me to pick one, that'd be it. There's a sound running underneath this scene, and it's a shower. Walt is home. He's singing to himself badly, the way people do when they're alone in the house. And while he's in there, 2 men in beautifully cut gray suits walk into his home without making any noise at all. Marco and Leonel Salamanca have come up from Mexico to kill Walter White for the death of their cousin, and they are not remotely improvising. They've already murdered a lorry full of people to get across the border. They walk on foot through the desert. They carry a silver axe. They are, in terms of pure professional threat, the most dangerous thing that has ever pointed itself at Walt, and they do not talk, hesitate, or negotiate. They go through the house. They check the rooms, and then, because he's still in the shower and there's no hurry, they sit down on the end of his bed and wait for him. One of them picks something up off the dresser to pass the time. It's a small plastic eye. He turns it over in his fingers, this silent man with an axe, examining a piece of a burnt teddy bear that came out of the sky because a woman died in a bedroom 18 months earlier. He has absolutely no idea what he's holding, neither does he care. He puts it back down slightly out of place. Then a phone buzzes. One word on the screen, Paulos. And they get up and leave. That's Gus Fring, who has had Mike watching the house, and who has decided, for reasons entirely his own, to do with a chemist he wants working for him and a war he doesn't want yet, that Walter White is not to be killed today. The cousins obey immediately because whatever else they are, they're disciplined. Walt comes out of the bathroom with a towel around him. He looks at the dresser. Something's not where he left it, and he can't work out what. He glances around the room, a bit unsettled, and then gets on with his evening. He never finds out. That's what makes this one sit differently to everything else on the list. There's no near miss he can point to afterwards, no adrenaline, no lesson learned. A man with an axe sat on his bed for several minutes and left because of a text message. And Walter White's entire experience of it is a vague feeling that the room looks slightly odd. The margin was the length of a shower. Meanwhile, Hank is standing outside an RV with a crowbar in his hands. The route he took to get there is a horrible little accident of family life. The Whites think Jesse Pinkman is selling Walt marijuana, so Hank, being helpful, being an uncle, decides to go and lean on the little scrote. That leads him to the RV, which he's been hunting for months as a lead in the Heisenberg case without ever suspecting the 2 threads are the same thread. And Walt and Jesse are inside it, in a scrapyard. waiting to have the thing crushed because they'd finally worked out it was a liability. So there's a wall of aluminium between a DEA agent and the entire case, and Walt is on the wrong side of it with lungs that could betray him with a cough at any second. 3 separate people have to behave in 3 specific ways over the next 10 minutes for him to survive this. First, old Joe, the scrapyard owner, who turns out to have an unexpectedly firm grasp of the Fourth Amendment. He starts talking about the thing as a dwelling rather than a vehicle, and therefore covered by the protections that apply to somebody's home. He asks Hank whether he actually saw it driven in. He points out that a vehicle that doesn't run isn't a vehicle for these purposes. It's a stalling argument. And both men know it's a stalling argument, but it's legally coherent enough that Hank has to stand there and engage with it. Second, Saul Goodman answers his phone. Walt gets a call out and Saul improvises, and his secretary Francesca rings Hank, claiming Marie has been in a serious car accident. Third, and this is the bit people forget, Hank believes it instantly and completely. He doesn't verify. He doesn't ring the hospital first. He drops the crowbar and he's gone. Because that's who Hank Schreider is about his wife. By the time he works out it was a lie and comes back furious, the RV is a cube. The thing I like about this one is how visibly the show is stacking the deck and how openly it admits it. That's 3 unrelated interventions inside one window, and if any of them fails, Hank opens that door and finds his brother-in-law standing in a mobile methamphetamine laboratory with a bullet-holed windscreen. There's no explanation for that. There's no fugue state that covers it. Walt survives because a scrapyard owner read up on his rights and a lawyer had a secretary who could cry on demand. The corridor is full of DEA agents. Hank is upstairs having survived being shot in a car park. One of the cousins is dead, and the other, Leonel, both legs crushed under a car, is in the same hospital under guard. Half the Albuquerque field office is in the building, some of them donating blood, all of them still running on the adrenaline of nearly losing one of their own. Walt is there as family, standing in a hallway being supportive to Marie, doing the concerned brother-in-law. Then word comes down that Leonel is awake and the agents go and Walt follows them. He follows them. Nobody asks him to. He has no reason to be in that room and every conceivable reason not to be. And he walks up to the doorway of a cartel assassin who came to his house to kill him and stands there in plain view. Leonel sees him. And what happens next is genuinely one of the most disturbing 30 seconds in the show because this man has no legs to speak of and multiple lines running into his arms, and he still gets himself off the bed and onto the floor and starts dragging himself across the tiles towards Walt, leaving a smear behind him with a room full of federal agents scrambling to hold him down. He is inches from identifying Heisenberg to the DEA. That's all it would take. A name, a pointed finger, anything. He says nothing. He can't, and he wouldn't have anyway, and whatever else the cousins were. They didn't talk, and that silence is a code they'd have kept in any circumstance. And the agents in the room are far too occupied wrestling a violent assassin back onto a bed to stop and wonder why he's fixated on the bloke in the cardigan. Mike gets to him later that night on Gus's orders, and that's the end of it. So that's a second person who had the whole thing in their head and lost the chance to say it out loud. We're not even halfway through the show. 2 dealers are standing in a residential street next to a kid on a bicycle. They're the ones who used a child to do their killing for them, which is why Jesse is walking towards them with a gun and no plan and every intention of dying in the next few seconds. He's completely outmatched and he knows it. So does Walt, watching from a distance. And Walt drives his Pontiac Aztek straight into both of them at speed. One goes over the bonnet, the other is pinned. Walt gets out, picks up the fallen weapon, and shoots the survivor in the head at close range while the man is on the ground. Then he looks at Jesse and says one word, "Run," and drives off. It is a daylight double homicide with a motor vehicle and a firearm on a residential street in a city with a functioning police force. And it definitely comes up again. Not once the double homicide is briefly referenced again. There's no investigation that touches Walt. No forensics on the Aztec, which he keeps driving for another season and a half with the damage on it. No witness, no canvassing. The show simply moves on, and the next time you see that car, it's got a bent bumper, and Hank is the only one in the world of the story who has asked about it. Now, you can argue that 2 dealers being killed on a corner in that neighborhood doesn't generate the same police response as, say, a chemistry teacher exploding a BMW. That's probably fair, but there was a child on a bike about 15 feet away. There were houses. There was a car with paint transfer and body damage registered to a man whose brother-in-law works for the DEA. I've always found the silence around this one much louder than the scene itself. Walt commits one of his most direct and physical acts of violence in the entire series. No chemistry, no distance, no plausible deniability, just a bloke in a family car running 2 men over, and the world doesn't react at all immediately. That's not a close call. That's an absence of a call that should have happened, which is a slightly different item on the list but belongs on it just as much. And here's a detail I think about more than I probably should. If you tally up the number of times Hank Schrader has physically held evidence of Walter White's crimes in his own hands, by this point in the story, it goes something like this. The gas mask from the desert traced to Walt's own school, the security footage of Walt stealing a barrel of methylamine, the RV which he had found in the desert, a duffel bag of drug money which Walter personally carried to a car after Hank was told exactly what was in it, a brother-in-law who disappeared for days and came back with a story he couldn't verify. That's 5. 5 separate occasions, none of them ambiguous, all of them just beyond his grasp. And every single time the same filter catches it before it reaches his conclusions. We've been through why, so I won't labor it. But the arithmetic is worth saying out loud, because when people describe Walt as brilliant at evading the DEA, what they're mostly describing is one man's inability to see a thing that was standing in his kitchen. Where we're going next is season 4. And the character of the luck shifts again, stops being free. From here, quite a lot of what saves Walter White involves somebody dying who didn't strictly have to. A man is cooking competently in the super lab, and he's rather enjoying himself. Victor has been Gus's fixer, driver, and general instrument of policy for a long time, and he has evidently been paying attention down in that lab. Because with Walt and Jesse zip-tied and kneeling on the floor, waiting to find out whether they're going to be killed, Victor fires up the equipment and starts running the cook himself. Weighing, adding, adjusting. Showing off, honestly, making a point. The point being, we don't need you, and it's an effective point because he's not doing it badly. He's doing it well enough that the thing keeping Walt breathing, his irreplaceability, visibly evaporates in front of him. Then Gus arrives and doesn't say a single word for what feels like an extremely long time. He takes off his jacket, he folds it, he puts on a hazmat suit and rolls the sleeves down properly. He picks up a box cutter. Walt starts talking because talking is all he has. You kill me, you have nothing. You kill Jesse, you don't have me. It's not a bad argument, it's just an argument nobody has agreed to hear. And Gus walks past both of them and opens Victor's throat. Even Mike is startled. You can see his hand go to his weapon on pure instinct before he catches himself, and Mike is not a man who gets startled. Now, the reason this happened is not that Gus was persuaded by Walt's speech. It's much colder than that. Earlier that night, Victor had gone to Gail Bedeker's flat, and he had been seen there. Neighbors saw his face, which means that from Gus's perspective, Victor is no longer an asset who can quietly replace a chemist. He's a man whose face is attached to a murder scene, and therefore a liability with a shelf life. So the one person in the building who could do Walt's job became the one person in the building who had to go. And that's about as close to a coin flip on Walt's life as this show ever gets. Victor is competent, loyal, available, and already knows the process. The only thing wrong with him is a piece of bad luck that had nothing to do with Walt at all. If those neighbors are asleep, if the timing of that visit is 20 minutes different, Victor stays useful, Gus has his replacement, and there is no reason on earth to keep 2 men alive who have just murdered his chemist. Walt watches a man die and correctly understands that he's watching a demonstration. What he doesn't seem to fully register is that he's also watching a job interview he only passed because the other candidate got unlucky. The dinner is Walt's idea, and it's excruciating from the first minute. They're at Hank and Marie's, and Hank is deep into his recovery and deep into the evidence boxes because being immobile has turned him from a good investigator into a slightly obsessive one with unlimited time. And at some point in the evening, he decides to show Walt the thing he's been working on. It's Gail Bedeker's laboratory notebook, which is, if you stop and think about what's actually sitting on that table, a genuine catastrophe. It's a complete technical record of the blue meth process, handwritten, annotated, in the possession of the DEA. It's got sketches, calculations, procedures. It is the closest thing to a signed confession that the entire operation ever produced. And on the front, in Gail's careful handwriting, there's a dedication to WW, my star, my perfect silence. Hank taps it and asks, genuinely amused, who Walt reckons that might be. He starts throwing out names, Woodrow Wilson, Willy Wonka, and then, grinning, Walter White. Walt raises both hands and says, "You got me," which is the second time in the series he's confessed directly to Hank's face for the pleasure of not being believed, and it works for the same reason it worked with the duffel bag. The pause afterwards is where the danger lives. It's about a beat and a half, and Cranston plays it beautifully because you can see the man realize he's overplayed it and needs somewhere to go immediately. Where he goes is Walt Whitman. He flips a few pages and produces the passage Gail had copied out from Leaves of Grass and offers it up as the obvious explanation, and Hank buys it and moves on to the next thing. And look, I'm sorry, but that excuse is thin. It's really thin. Hank is a professional investigator with an active case, holding a notebook dedicated to WWW, sitting directly opposite a world-class chemist named Walter White. The correct number of follow-up questions here is at least one. Gail was a chemist. Chemists dedicate their work to other chemists far more often than they dedicate it to 19th century poets. And even if the poem is in there, that doesn't rule out the initials being a joke between two people who work together. The distance between Walt and a pair of handcuffs at that table was one more question, asked over pudding, and it never got asked, because Hank preferred the version with the poetry in it. Honestly, I find it a bit funny, not the situation, the sheer nerve of the man. He puts his hands up and confesses as a bit, and then has to think his way out of the bit at speed. He should not have got away with that. The cover story for the day is a mineral show. That's what Walt's been told. The plan is a mineral survey. He's driving Hank out to look at rocks, doing his dutiful thing, and about 10 minutes in, Hank tells him to take a different turning. They're going to Los Pollos Hermanos, because Hank has developed a theory, and the theory is correct, and he explains it to Walt with the eager delight of a man who's been stuck in a house for months and finally has something to chase. There's a fast food chain owner, a philanthropist, a man who donates to the DEA, and Hank thinks he's moving methamphetamine. Then he hands Walt a GPS tracker and asks him to go and stick it on the man's car. Sit with the position that puts Walt in for a second because it's genuinely unwinnable. If he refuses, he has to explain why a chemistry teacher won't do a small favor for his disabled brother-in-law, and the refusal itself becomes the interesting thing in the room. If he agrees, he's actively assisting a federal investigation into a man who has people killed for considerably less. And if Gus finds that tracker later without context, Walt is a DEA informant and Walt is dead. Two pieces of luck rescue him, and they're both completely outside his control. The first is that Hank brought him at all. If Gomez had been available that day, if Hank's actual partner, an actual DEA agent, had been sitting in that passenger seat, the surveillance gets run by professionals. Walt is never handed the device, and he never gets an opportunity to protect himself or his position. He'd simply have been a bystander to an operation closing in on his own employer with no way to intervene. The second is that Gus was standing at the counter, not in the office, not at another location. He was at the chicken farm, standing behind the till in person on that particular afternoon so that Walt could walk in, put the tracker on the counter in front of him, and explain the whole thing in real time before doing anything irreversible. That's what saves it. Because Gus, given the information immediately, decides to treat the tracker as an asset, a channel for feeding the DEA whatever he'd like them to believe. He tells Walt to go ahead and do it. If Gus had been 10 minutes away, Walt plants a device blind on the car of the most careful criminal in the American Southwest and waits for it to be found. Walt survives that day because a man happened to be working the counter. This is the funniest one on the list, and I'm going to enjoy it. The gambling story has been holding up reasonably well as an explanation for the family's sudden financial comfort. It's a bit thin, but it's survivable. And the important thing is that it's consistent. Walt then buys himself a Chrysler 300 and buys his teenage son a brand new Dodge Challenger and parks both of them on the driveway of a house that is supposedly funded by a man who wins at cards sometimes. Skylar comes home and very nearly has a fit, and she's right to. The IRS is not a hypothetical concern in this family. There's an entire other storyline running about exactly that, and 2 conspicuous cars appearing overnight is precisely the shape of thing that gets noticed. She tells him to take it back, and a normal person takes it back. Walt drives it out to an empty stretch of desert, leaves it there after a bullet hole in the tank drains all the fuel, and the car is later found abandoned. And then sits there at a comfortable distance and rings for a taxi, gives his own name, gives the location, discusses how long it'll take. The luck here is purely about who might have been looking. That's a public car park. There is an abandoned vehicle out in the desert registered to him in the city where his brother-in-law works for federal law enforcement. Arson is not a small charge. Insurance fraud sits next to it. And the moment anyone asks the obvious question, why is a chemistry teacher destroying a $40,000 car he bought last week? The gambling story doesn't survive the first 5 minutes of that conversation. It's the sort of behavior that makes an investigator curious about everything else. Nobody rings it in early enough. Nothing gets traced. Saul sorts the paperwork side afterwards and it evaporates. But my favorite part remains the phone call. There's something about a man committing arson and then politely confirming that yes, it's the Pavilion car park just south of the airport that captures exactly what Walt has become by this point in the show. Not careful, not calm, simply convinced at a cellular level that things do not happen to him. Which, given the run he's been on, is a conclusion he's arrived at with a certain amount of supporting evidence. Hank asks for a right turn and everything goes cold. Walt thinks they're driving to the chicken farm, which is survivable. The farm's clean, the farm's a front, there's nothing there. Then Hank changes the plan mid-journey and mentions an industrial laundry he'd like to have a look at, because he's connected an expensive filtration and air handling system to Gail Bettaker, and worked out that a super lab needs somewhere with a lot of power and a lot of ventilation. He's right, he is completely right. That laundry sits directly on top of the lab, and Walt is currently driving the man towards the front door of the entire operation with his own hands on the steering wheel. Walt tries talking him out of it first, says it sounds thin, sounds like a shot in the dark, points out that a big conglomerate probably owns dozens of these. Hank isn't having it. He's already laid out his reasoning and he likes his reasoning, so Walt drives past the entrance. Hank tells him he's missed it, tells him to turn round. And Walt, out of options and about 11 seconds from disaster, waits for a gap in the oncoming traffic to close, and then swings the car deliberately into it. I want to be precise about why this belongs on tonight's list, because it's a slightly different animal to the others. This isn't luck arriving. This is Walt manufacturing a coin flip and then winning it. He put a car into oncoming traffic at speed with a disabled passenger who was still recovering from paralysis, and he had no real way of controlling what hit them. He couldn't see what was coming round that bend. He didn't know the speed, the mass, the driver's reactions. A saloon car is survivable. An articulated lorry is not, and neither is a van, and neither is a slightly worse angle of impact. They both walk away with minor injuries. Hank has a lump on his head and a shaken-up afternoon, and by the time anyone's in a position to go back to the laundry, the moment's gone. And the counterfactual here is properly grim. If that oncoming vehicle is heavier or 10 miles an hour faster, Walter White's entire story ends as a man who killed himself and his brother-in-law in a road accident on a Tuesday. No empire, no legacy, no Ozymandias, nothing. Just a bad crash on a stretch of road outside Albuquerque, and 2 funerals, and a family who never find out why. He bet both their lives to buy about 4 days, and he'd tell you it worked. There's a rooftop and a car park, and a car that never gets used. The plan was elegant in the way Walt's plans are when he's frightened. Gus visits Hector Salamanca at the nursing home. Gus's car sits in the same spot every time. Walt builds a remote detonated pipe bomb, attaches it under the vehicle, and waits on a nearby roof for a man to walk out and get in. Gus walks out, stops, and looks at the car. He doesn't touch it. He stands there for several seconds, reading something in the air that nobody else can see. And then he turns around and walks away on foot, leaving the vehicle exactly where it is, which leaves Walt in an extraordinarily bad position, because there is now a live, improvised, explosive device attached to the underside of a car in a public car park with his fingerprints all over the design and no way to leave it there. So he goes down, retrieves it, and puts it in a bag. And then, and this is the part I struggle with every time, he takes it into a hospital. He's looking for Jesse because Brock is in that hospital being treated for poisoning and Jesse will be there, and Walt needs to know where he stands. So he walks through a hospital, through corridors full of doctors and patients and children, past a police presence that is on alert precisely because there's been a suspicious poisoning of a child on the premises, carrying a device powerful enough to take out a substantial section of the building in a hold-all. Visibly nervous, sweating, he sits down next to Jesse in a waiting area with the bag between his feet. And while he's sitting there, police officers arrive to take Jesse away for questioning. They stand directly in front of him. They speak to Jesse. "Detective this, Albuquerque Police, could we have a few minutes of your time?" Nobody asks about the bag. Nobody looks at it. Nobody wonders why the anxious middle-aged man in the waiting room is carrying something that heavy in a building on security alert. One officer with a bit of spare attention, one routine request to step aside and open it, and Walter White spends the remainder of his life in a federal prison on charges that have nothing to do with methamphetamine at all. There's no gambling story that covers a pipe bomb. There's no clever explanation. That is the end, immediately and permanently. He was invisible because the police were busy dealing with a crisis that he had personally created, which is, when you lay it out like that, an almost perfect summary of how the man operates. The thing everyone remembers about Face Off is the bell and the wheelchair and the door swinging open and half of Gustavo Fring walking out of it adjusting his tie. Fair enough, it's an extraordinary bit of television. But that whole sequence rests on 2 dependencies that Walt had no ability to guarantee, and both of them could have gone the other way. The first is that Brock survives. Walt poisoned a 6-year-old with berries from a lily-of-the-valley plant in order to make Jesse believe that Gus was capable of poisoning children. That's the maneuver. And the medical reality of it is that lily of the valley is genuinely dangerous. It affects the heart, it can kill, and the outcome in a small child depends on dose, timing, and how quickly somebody works out what they're looking at. Walt was calibrating a poison for a body he'd never examined, administered by a route he couldn't fully control in a child he'd met once. Brock recovers. And because Brock recovers, Jesse comes back into the fold and the whole plan proceeds. If Brock had died, Jesse doesn't become an ally, he becomes an executioner. He was already standing in Walt's kitchen with a gun to his head over exactly this. And the only thing that talked him down was a redirection of blame that only holds together as long as there isn't a small coffin in it. There is no version of that scenario where Walt survives a grieving Jesse Pinkman who eventually works out what actually happened. The second dependency is Hector Salamanca. Walt needs Gus in a room he doesn't control, and the only person on Earth who can put him there is a man who hates Gus more than he hates anything else. So Walt goes to a nursing home and asks a mute, paralyzed old cartel figure who despises him personally, who spat at him, who considers him beneath contempt, to be used as bait, and Hector has to agree, not be tricked into it. Agree actively with full understanding by ringing a bell, which he does because Gus killed his family and his loyalties are older and deeper than his disgust at Walt. But that was never a certainty. That's a man in the last week of his life choosing between two kinds of hatred, and Walt walked in with nothing to offer him except an opportunity. So the most celebrated piece of strategy in the entire series required a poisoned child to recover and an enemy to volunteer. I think that's worth saying plainly because it's usually filed under Walt being 3 moves ahead. He was 3 moves ahead. He was also, on both counts, extremely fortunate. Now let's talk a little about the difference between a plan and a bet, because there's a pattern I've noticed running through everything we've covered tonight, and it's remarkably consistent once you start checking for it. Every scheme Walter White constructs contains exactly one variable he cannot control. Not 2, not 5, 1. The rest of it is genuinely well built. He's thought about the sequencing, he's thought about the failure modes, he's thought about what people will believe and why. And then, right in the middle of the design, there's a single hole where something has to go a particular way, and he fills that hole with confidence rather than planning. Sometimes the variable is a person's mood. Sometimes it's a piece of hardware. Sometimes it's the speed of an oncoming car. It's never the same category twice, which is part of why it's hard to spot. And the show almost never lets him notice this. There's no scene where Walt sits down afterwards and audits which part of the win was his. He collects the outcome and he files it under competence every single time, and the file gets a bit thicker and a bit more dangerous with each entry. I think that's the actual tragedy of the character, more than the ego or the money. He's a scientist who stopped checking his own results. Anyway, Season 5, where the coin starts landing the other way up. Hank has a new office, and he's rather proud of it. He's been promoted to Ace AC, which means a bigger room, a window, blinds he can close, and a desk he's still in the process of arranging. There's a moment right before Walt arrives where Hank sets a framed photograph of himself and Marie down on that desk, adjusts it, and gets it how he wants it. Small domestic detail, means nothing at the time. Walt comes in to admire the office and make some small talk about the office, and then he starts crying, and it's a proper performance. Skylar doesn't love him anymore. She thinks he's a bad influence on the children. She thinks he's a bad father. He goes right to the bottom of it, wet-eyed and broken, in front of a man who would genuinely rather be shot again than sit in a room with another adult male's feelings. Hank lasts about 90 seconds. Then he's up, muttering about coffee, and out of the door. Which is exactly what Walt was counting on, and it's worth being clear that this part isn't luck at all. It's a precise read of a specific person's discomfort, and it's one of the coldest things he ever does. He knows Hank will flee. He built the whole visit on it. The second the door shuts, the tears stop like a tap being turned off, and Walt gets to work. An inline transmitter goes into the Ethernet port on Hank's computer. Then he picks up that framed photograph, opens the back, and puts a receiver inside it. And while he's still holding it, the door opens. Hank comes back with the coffee and finds his brother-in-law standing there with a photo of Hank and Marie in his hands. And Walt sells it instantly, the sad man looking at a picture of a marriage that works, envying it. Hank buys it and feels awkward all over again. The margin on that was a door handle, not a plan, not a contingency, not a fallback. Walt had precisely as long as it takes a man to walk down a corridor, pour 2 coffees, and walk back, and he used every second of it, plus a bit, he didn't have. If Hank had come back 10 seconds earlier, he'd have walked in on Walter White with the back off a picture frame and a piece of surveillance equipment in his hand, inside a federal building in the office of the agent running the case against him. There's no story for that. Not a bad story, not a thin story, none. And I've always thought there's something quietly awful about which object he chose to hide it in. He could have used the underside of the desk, a plant pot, the light fitting. He put it in a photograph of 2 people who love each other in the office of a man who trusts him. You mostly hear this one rather than see it. Walt is handcuffed in the back of a DEA vehicle in the middle of the desert, having just been arrested by his own brother-in-law at the spot where his money is buried. It's over. He's rung Jack's crew to come and kill Jesse, then rung them back to call it off once he realized Hank had him, and the calling off didn't take, so the trucks come anyway. And what follows is a gunfight between 2 federal agents and a heavily armed white supremacist gang in open desert at close range with automatic weapons for several minutes. Rounds go through vehicles, rounds go through everything. It's chaotic and unglamorous and shot mostly from a distance, and it is the deadliest environment anyone in this show has ever stood in. Walt is inside a car for the whole of it, cuffed, on the floor, unable to move, unable to take cover properly, unable to influence a single thing that happens. He survives a firefight by being restrained during it. That's genuinely all there is to it. Hank and Gomez are killed. Walt, sitting in a vehicle in the middle of the exchange with no armor and no control, comes out of it with nothing worse than what he already had. The rounds went where they went. And I don't think I've got a clever observation to make about this one because the scene doesn't leave room for one. It's the point in the story where the show stops being about a man outmaneuvering people and starts being about a man watching things happen to other people because of him. He gets out of the car afterwards and the desert is completely quiet. There are 7 barrels in a hole in the ground and they contain about $80 million. Jack's crew have just dug them up. They've killed 2 DEA agents, they've taken Jesse, and they are, by any reasonable expectation, going to take all of it, because there is nobody left in that desert with any ability to stop them and no reason on earth to be generous. Jack takes 6 and leaves 1. That's roughly $11 million left in a hole as a gesture. He says something about how there ought to be some kind of limit, how he doesn't want to be greedy about it, and he means it in his own peculiar way. There's a code operating in that man's head, and one of its rules is that you don't clean somebody out entirely. It's the same instinct that later makes him insist he isn't a liar, which is what eventually kills him. But it is an arbitrary decision made in about 4 seconds by a man who had no obligation whatsoever, and everything Walt does afterwards runs on that barrel. The escape to New Hampshire is paid for out of it. Ed's fee comes out of it. The months in the cabin come out of it. The money he eventually launders to his son through Elliot, and Gretchen comes out of it. The entire final act of Breaking Bad, every choice, every journey, every last piece of business Walt gets to conduct, is funded by a whim. If Jack takes all 8, Walt is a man alone in a desert with no money, no transport, no allies, a family that has just watched him destroy itself, and a nationwide manhunt starting the following morning. He doesn't get to New Hampshire, he doesn't get to come back, he's picked up at a bus station within the week. Instead, you get that image, which I think is the best single shot in the whole series. A man in the middle of an enormous empty landscape, rolling a plastic barrel across the sand on his own, hour after hour in complete silence. He's got $11 million and nowhere to put it and nobody to give it to. The shop is full of broken appliances and a man behind the counter who does not want to chat. I find this one quietly hilarious, and I don't think that's disrespectful to the material. Because after everything, after the cartel, the super lab, the DEA, the nursing home, the desert, the barrel, the thing that determines whether Walter White gets a final act is whether a small business is trading normally. The setup is that Saul has a contact, a man who, for a substantial fee, makes people disappear. New identity, new location, no questions, one way. Walt has heard about him for a while and has now reached the point of needing him. And every single link in that chain has to be intact. Saul has to still be reachable, which he barely is by this point. The contact has to still be operating, which is not a given for a business whose entire model depends on never being noticed. He has to have availability, and he has to be willing to take on a client who is currently the most wanted man in the American Southwest with federal attention at a level he'd normally run a mile from. And he has to be trustworthy in a line of work where there is no recourse at all if he isn't. Ed is all of those things. He's professional, he's dry, he's unimpressed, and he does exactly what he says he'll do. He drives Walt to New Hampshire in the back of a tanker, he brings supplies. He plays cards with him when Walt is so isolated he's paying $10,000 an hour for company. Enormous amounts of the last act depend on a service industry for criminals functioning like a service industry, reliably, on schedule, on a Tuesday. And there's something about the setting that makes it funnier than it should be. Two men in a back room behind a shop that fixes Hoovers arranging the vanishing of a drug kingpin, while somewhere out front, a customer is presumably waiting for a bag replacement. I do love that the show never winks at it. Ed is played completely straight, which is why it lands. He's already given up by the time this scene starts. That's the bit people forget. Walt has been in that cabin for months. The cancer's back and moving. His son has refused to speak to him and told him with total clarity that he wants him to die. He's tried to send money and had it returned. He is completely alone in a snowed-in property with a cardboard box of cash and no reason to be alive. So he walks down the hill to a bar, orders a drink, uses the payphone, and calls the DEA on himself. He gives his name, he tells them where he is, and then he hangs up and he sits down at the bar with his whiskey to wait for them to come and get him, because that is genuinely the plan. He's finished. The manhunt can end at a bar in New Hampshire, and he doesn't much care. And then the television above the bar cuts to an interview. Elliot and Gretchen Schwartz on Charlie Rose, talking about the Gray Matter Technologies Foundation and their program to fund drug treatment across the Southwest, and inevitably being asked about their former colleague. And Gretchen says that the Walter White they knew is gone, and that his contribution to the company was essentially the name, nothing more. You watch Walt's face change, and it's a rewind. It's a man being reassembled out of pure resentment in about 15 seconds. He gets up and he leaves, and the police arrive to an empty bar. Two pieces of luck sit on top of each other here, and they're both about timing. The first is that the broadcast happened to be on that screen in that window, a nationally televised interview, discussing him personally playing in a bar in rural New Hampshire in the 10 minutes between his surrender and his arrest. The second is that the response time was slow enough. He's the most wanted man in the country, he's just phoned in his own location, and there is enough of a gap for him to change his mind and walk out. And I'll be honest about my feelings on this one, because lucky doesn't sit comfortably. Lucky for whom exactly? He'd have died in custody within months, and quite a few people would still be alive. What he gets instead is the opportunity to go back and finish things, which he does, and some of what he finishes is arguably good, and quite a lot of it isn't. The show is scrupulously neutral about it, and I think that's the right call. It just shows you a man deciding not to be arrested because somebody belittled his legacy on television. There's snow on a windscreen and a man scraping at it with his sleeve. The car is a Volvo, unlocked, parked in the road. Walt gets in with his box of money, coughing badly, hands not working properly because it's genuinely freezing and he's genuinely dying. He goes through the glove box and finds a Marty Robbins cassette and a screwdriver, and he tries to start the car with the screwdriver, and he can't because his fingers won't do it. And he isn't actually a man who knows how to steal a car. Then blue light starts flashing across the ice on the windscreen. A police cruiser is coming up the road. He's a fugitive with a stolen vehicle and a box of drug money on the passenger seat and nowhere to go. And he stops moving and he says the only prayer he ever offers in the whole series. Just get me home. Just get me home, I'll do the rest. The cruiser passes. Nobody looks at the snow-covered car. Nobody runs a plate. Nobody stops. Nobody notices anything at all, because a buried vehicle in a New Hampshire street in winter is the least interesting object on Earth. And then he reaches up and pulls down the sun visor, and the keys drop into his lap. Now, I know some people find that too convenient, and I understand why. It is convenient, but I've always thought it's the single most honest moment in the finale because it makes the deal explicit. He asks for exactly one thing, get me there, the rest is mine, and the show gives it to him immediately and without comment, and then holds him to the second half of the sentence for the rest of the episode. It also rhymes with where we started tonight, which I don't think is an accident. The first hour of this program has a man in a desert saved by not understanding a mechanical device. The last hour has a man in the snow saved by a mechanical detail he had nothing to do with. Same shape, opposite ends, 60-odd hours of television in between. He knocks the snow off the window, the cassette starts playing, and he drives about 2,000 miles. The last one is a search that stops one panel too early. Walt has built something in the back of his car. It's a machine gun mounted on a motorized rig, wired to a garage door opener, aimed through the boot, and set to sweep. It's a genuinely clever piece of engineering, and he put it together in a garage from parts, which is very much his kind of solution to a problem. But it only functions if two things happen. The car has to be parked in a specific position relative to the building, and Walt has to be inside that building holding the remote. He drives into Jack's compound with one of the crew in the passenger seat telling him where to park, and he ignores the instruction and parks where he needs to. Nobody makes an issue of it, which is the first small piece of it. Then they search him properly. He gets out, arms out, and they pat him down for weapons and check him for a wire, and they take his keys and his wallet off him and put them on a pool table. Somebody goes through the interior of the vehicle. Nobody opens the boot. That's it. That's the entire hinge of the finale. A crew of armed, paranoid, professionally suspicious men who have every reason to believe this man might be a problem go over the vehicle and never once lift the boot lid. Whether you file that under luck or under the writers being kind probably depends on what sort of mood you're in. I lean towards luck because the show has been doing exactly this for 5 seasons and has never pretended otherwise. This is the same category of event as a bag that doesn't get unzipped, a notebook that doesn't get a follow-up question, a photo frame that gets put down 2 seconds before a door opens. And if that guard is slightly more thorough, everything that happens next doesn't. Walt is shot in that clubhouse within about 90 seconds of Jack deciding he's not useful. Jesse eventually escapes that cage. Lydia carries on. Nobody finds out where Hank and Gomez are buried, and Skylar has nothing to trade. The last significant event of Walter White's life was somebody else deciding a job was thorough enough. Let me double back slightly because there's one from the middle of season 5 I skipped past and it deserves a proper look. Mike Ehrmantraut spends the better part of 2 seasons wanting Walter White dead and being right about it and not doing it. There's a moment in a car park where he puts a gun to Walt's head while Walt is zip-tied to a radiator, having just walked out of an office with a barrel of methylamine that wasn't his to take. There's another where he's got him at gunpoint at a rendezvous over the money for his men. He tells Jesse more than once and in plain language that Walt is a poisonous liability and that everything he touches turns to disaster. He's assessed the man correctly and he said so out loud, and every single time something stops him. Jesse talks him down. The business gets in the way, There's a deal to be done, a payment to be collected, an obligation to 9 men and their families that requires the operation to keep running for a bit longer. That's a slow, grinding piece of luck rather than a dramatic one, and I think it's easy to miss because it doesn't happen in a single scene. But the plain fact is that the most competent operator in the entire show wanted Walt gone from about the moment they met, had multiple clear opportunities, and was talked out of it by circumstance every time. Walt survives Mike the way you survive a coastline, not by beating it, by the tide going out at the right moments. And when it finally does go the other way, it isn't Mike getting his chance. It's Walt shooting him in a fit of pique over an insult on a riverbank for no strategic reason at all, which is possibly the clearest illustration going of how differently these two men operated. This one's from Ozymandias, and it's the strangest entry tonight because it's a piece of luck that only becomes luck later. Walt has taken his daughter. That's where the day has got to. He's driven off with an infant in a car seat because his family have physically thrown him out of the house. And Skylar has run down the middle of the street after the car. Then he rings her and he does the performance of his life. It's the abusive husband monologue. He tells her she never respected him, that she was a bad wife, that she has no idea who she's dealing with, that she should have listened, that he built an empire and she got in the way of it. It is genuinely difficult to sit through, and Anna Gunn plays the receiving end of it perfectly. Because Skylar realizes what's happening about halfway through and has to keep her face still. The reason he's doing it is to hand her a defense. There are police in that house, listening on the line, and Walt is deliberately performing a man who terrorized his wife into compliance, so that when the prosecutors come for her, she has a documented, recorded, credible account of coercion. And here's where the luck sits. That only works if the police were recording. It only works if the tap was live, if the officers in the room were paying attention, if the recording was preserved and admissible and reached the right desk. None of which Walt could verify from a stolen car with a baby in the back and about 4 minutes before he had to abandon everything and disappear. He improvised an alibi for another person, Liv, in one take, on the assumption that the machinery on the other end was working properly. It was. And it did enough. She's not free of it. She's still in an enormous amount of trouble by the time we catch up with her in a flat with a strip light and an ashtray. But she isn't in prison, and that call is a substantial part of why. I've always found it a bit odd that this is the moment people reach for when they want to argue Walt loved his family. He'd taken her daughter. He came back and left her outside a fire station like a parcel. The phone call is a repair job on damage he caused about 90 minutes earlier. But it's still one of the sharpest things he ever does, and it still needed a police recorder to be switched on. And one more small one because I like it, and it never gets mentioned. The A1A car wash is Skylar's idea, and it's the correct idea, cash business, plausible volumes, boring, invisible, precisely what the operation needs to turn money into something a bank will accept. The problem is Bogdan. Bogdan owns it. Walt used to work there, and their relationship is not warm. There's history, most of it involving Walt being made to wipe down cars in front of his own students, and Bogdan initially refuses to sell and then tries to hold them up on price when he senses how badly they want it. Skylar eventually forces it through with a bit of manufactured environmental leverage, and it goes through at a sensible number. The luck is that a suitable business existed at all in the right city at the right price, at the exact point in the story when the money needed somewhere to go. Laundering isn't a thing you can improvise. You need a front with real books and real customers and a real history. And there's a very short list of businesses that can absorb that kind of cash without the ratios looking mad on paper. If Bogdan had held firm, and he nearly did, Walt is sitting on rapidly accumulating cash with nowhere to put it, at exactly the moment when the IRS is already sniffing around the family through the Beneke connection. There's a version of this show where the walls close in through an accountant rather than a DEA agent, and it's considerably less cinematic, but rather more likely. Instead, they get a car wash and a frame on the wall, and Walt gets to stand behind a till telling people to have an A1 day, which he clearly hates, and which is, in fairness, funny. Before we wind down, there are a handful I didn't give their own section to, mostly because they're a bit slighter, but they're all worth a mention, and a couple of them are genuinely absurd. So here they are, in no particular order. Jesse pulls the trigger, right at the end of Season 3's setup. Walt sends Jesse to shoot Gail Bedecker, and the entire logic of that plan depends on a man who has never killed anybody actually going through with it. Jesse is standing in a stranger's doorway crying with a gun in his hand. And the stranger is a mild, decent, slightly odd chap making coffee. It's about the least likely murder in the series. If Jesse lowers that weapon and walks away, which he very nearly does, you can see it. Gail lives. Gail is entirely capable of running the lab. And Walt and Jesse are both surplus to requirements by the weekend. Walt bet his life on Jesse Pinkman's ability to do something Jesse Pinkman is fundamentally not built for, and won. The IRS agent. This one's Skylar's rather than Walt's, but it protects them both. Ted Beneke's books are a disaster, and the auditor is one thread pull away from the whole thing. So Skylar walks into that meeting and performs a bimbo bookkeeper, giggling, apologizing, playing thick, taking the blame for entries she made deliberately. And it works, because the agent decides he's looking at incompetence rather than fraud, and downgrades the whole thing accordingly. If he'd looked harder at the person doing the performance rather than the numbers, the trail from Ted leads to Skylar, and the trail from Skylar leads absolutely everywhere. The magnet. The plan to wipe Gus's laptop from outside an evidence room by driving a lorry full of electromagnets up to the wall is structurally nonsense. It works on approximately no engineering principles that would survive scrutiny. And it does work, sort of. It wipes the drive, and it also knocks a photo frame off a wall and cracks it open, revealing an offshore account number that gives the DEA a new lead. So the plan succeeds and creates a fresh problem in the same 5 minutes, which is about the most Breaking Bad outcome available. Walt's luck here is that the fresh problem takes months to bear fruit rather than days, finding the tracker. After Hank works it out in the bathroom, he puts a GPS unit on Walt's car, the same kind of unit, incidentally, that the two of them once used together. And Walt finds it because he happens to be looking in the right place at the right moment, having noticed Hank behaving oddly. That discovery is what lets him get ahead of the whole thing and drive to Hank's garage and say his piece. If he doesn't spot it, he leads the DEA to a storage facility, and the endgame arrives about 8 episodes early. The confession video, and then the tape. Walt sits down in front of a camera and records a completely false account in which Hank is the mastermind and he's the terrified victim. And it is a beautifully constructed lie because every checkable detail in it is true. The gambling money that paid Hank's medical bills, the tracker Hank made him plant. It's built out of real events arranged in the wrong order. The luck is that Hank did all of those things, that a year of small favors and awkward family entanglements happened to produce a stack of verifiable facts that could be pointed the other way. Walt didn't engineer any of that. He just picked it up off the floor when he needed it. The lottery ticket, the coordinates of the burial site get written on a lottery ticket and stuck to the fridge door with a magnet, in a house that is, at that point, 1 warrant away from being turned over by federal agents. It's a lovely bit of hiding in plain sight, and it does its job, but the margin is essentially 0. Anyone with a reason to look at that fridge and the faintest curiosity about why a man who claims to have a gambling problem is keeping one specific ticket has $80 million and 2 burial plots inside about a day. It sits there for weeks. Walt Jr.'s website. Slightly different flavor, this one, because it's luck of a gentler sort. The fundraising site Walt Jr. sets up for his dad's treatment is the mechanism Saul uses to launder the first significant chunk of money into the household. Thousands of small anonymous donations that are, in fact, one large one going in circles. It only works because a teenager built a website out of love, and because nobody checked. If anyone had audited the donor pattern properly, it's an obvious wash. And the person who would have taken the fall is the child who set it up. Walt lets that risk sit on his son without comment, and it never comes home. The Fly. And I'll mention this one because I'm fond of it, even though it's arguably the smallest stake in the entire series. Walt spends an entire episode chasing an insect around the superlab in an escalating fit, exhausted, sleep-deprived, and about 4 sentences from telling Jesse the truth about Jane. He gets right up to the edge of it, talking about a night in a bar, about meeting a man, about how the timing of it all felt arranged, and then he stops, or the moment passes, or Jesse simply doesn't join the dots. It's a confession that almost happens by accident because a man is too tired to keep hold of himself, and it's headed off by nothing more than fatigue and a change of subject. Right, that's the last of them. So we started with a man in his underwear in a desert, saved by not knowing where safety catch was, and we finished with the same man in a compound in the same state, saved by somebody not opening a boot. 62 episodes apart, and structurally, they're the same event. That's the thing that stayed with me putting this together. It isn't that Walt got lucky occasionally, it's that the shape of his luck never changed. Something small, mechanical, or human that he had no hand in, going the way he needed it to at the moment he needed it. Over and over, for the length of an entire life's worth of decisions compressed into about a year. At the start of this, I said I'd put it at 60-40 in favor of luck, and I'd like to revise that, having gone through the lot in order. I think it's higher. I think it's closer to 70-30, and I think the reason it doesn't feel that way while you're watching is that Walt's competence and Walt's luck arrive in the same package, and he never separates them for us. He wins, he explains why he won, and the explanation is always about him. The show lets him narrate his own results, and we take the narration at face value because he's clever and confident, and we're watching from inside his head. But the actual load-bearing moments, the ones where the story would have stopped, are almost never the chemistry. They're a text message, a cup of coffee, a wife's decision not to make a phone call, a gang leader deciding he isn't greedy today. And I don't think that diminishes the show even slightly. I think it's the point. Because what Gilligan built is a machine that makes you complicit. You spend 5 seasons hoping the coin comes up heads for a man you have watched do genuinely unforgivable things. And the hoping is automatic, and you barely notice you're doing it until you sit down and count the flips. That's a properly sophisticated bit of storytelling, and it doesn't work if Walt is simply the cleverest man in every room. He has to be nearly caught. Constantly, forever, right up until he isn't. And then it stops. That's the other half of it, and it's why the ending lands the way it does. The luck doesn't gradually decline, it works and works and works, and then in the space of one afternoon in a desert, everything he built is taken from him by people he invited into it. And the machine that had been protecting him for a year simply isn't there anymore. Anyway, that's the lot. I've got a couple of things I'd like to do in this vein at some point if there's appetite for it. Every time Jesse got lucky is the obvious companion piece. And honestly, it might be the better video because Jesse's near misses are mostly other people choosing to protect him rather than physics doing him a favor, and that's a slightly warmer thing to spend 2 hours with. I'd also quite like to do Gus Fring's blind spots. Because for a man who was so careful about everything, the specific things he was careless about are extraordinarily revealing. And there's a whole separate evening in the close calls across Better Call Saul, which handles this same idea completely differently and in places better. But that's for another time. Thanks for keeping me company with this one. If you're still awake, that's grand, and if you drifted off somewhere around the desert, that's rather the idea. Take care of yourself. See you next time.